You didn't become quieter because you healed. And you didn't go quiet because you grew cold. That's the story people tell themselves when something inside them stops responding. But it's not what actually happened. What happened is more uncomfortable. One day, you noticed that your reactions didn't arrive on time anymore. Words reached you, but nothing moved. Voices filled the room, but they didn't land. You were present, technically, but internally, something stayed still. And what confused you the most was this. You weren't sad. You weren't angry. You weren't overwhelmed. You were unavailable. Not by choice. Not by effort. Just quiet. You still listened. You still nodded. You still showed up. But the part of you that used to lean forward, that part didn't move. And because there was no crisis, no visible breakdown, no dramatic collapse, you assumed this silence must mean strength, or maturity, or healing. But deep down, you sensed it wasn't relief. It felt more like a room inside you had gone dark, not violently, not suddenly, but as if the power had been cut long ago, and you were only noticing now. If this feels familiar, stay with it, because this kind of quiet doesn't come from peace. It comes from something that stopped working. The first thing you notice isn't the silence itself. It's the delay. Someone says something personal. Something that used to pull a reaction out of you. A complaint. A subtle accusation. A familiar emotional hook. And you feel nothing. Not numbness in the dramatic sense. Just a pause where something should have appeared. You search for the reaction. You wait for it to rise. It doesn't. You answer politely. Appropriately. But the emotional weight never arrives. Later, when you're alone, you replay the moment. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. And that's when the discomfort begins. Because for most of your life, your sensitivity worked like a reflex. You didn't decide to feel. You just did. Other people's moods entered you before you had time to filter them. Tension filled your chest. Disappointment tightened your throat. Joy lifted you instantly. That was your orientation system. That was how you knew where you stood with people. So when that reflex disappears, you don't immediately feel relief. You feel disoriented. You start asking quiet questions you don't say out loud. Why didn't that affect me? Why didn't I care? Why didn't my body react the way it always did? And the most unsettling realization follows shortly after. You didn't choose this. You didn't train yourself out of empathy. You didn't become detached on purpose. Something inside you simply didn't show up. It's like reaching for a familiar tool and realizing it's no longer in the drawer. Not broken, not stolen, just absent. And because there's no pain attached to its absence, you hesitate to name it as a loss. But it is. Because what disappeared wasn't emotion itself. It was the function that used to carry other people's emotions inside you. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Something that used to define how you move through the world has gone quiet, and you don't yet know what replaces it. It shows up in small moments first. A conversation that should have pulled you in, but doesn't. Someone is talking, sharing something personal, waiting for that familiar shift in your attention. You listen. You understand the words. You even respond kindly. But nothing inside you leans forward. Later, you realize the moment passed without leaving a trace. No aftertaste. No emotional residue. That's when it becomes unsettling. Because this isn't about being tired. And it isn't about being guarded. It's about the absence of an internal movement that used to happen automatically. There are situations where you notice it more clearly. A message arrives, long, emotionally loaded, subtly asking for reassurance. You read it once, then again. You know exactly what kind of response used to come next. You could almost write it from memory. But instead of feeling pulled to answer immediately, you pause. Not to think, not to calculate. You pause because the urgency is gone. and that pause changes something. On the other side, the person feels it, even if they don't understand it. The emotional current they expected doesn't meet them halfway. They might follow up. They might soften their tone. They might push slightly harder. And you notice yourself staying still. Not resistant, just unmoved. This is usually when confusion turns into guilt. Because for years, your presence functioned as emotional stabilization. You smoothed things out. You absorbed tension. You helped people feel understood, often before they even asked. That role gave you a place. And now, without it, you feel oddly undefined. You start sensing an unspoken disappointment in the room, not directed at something you did, but at something you no longer provide. You're still there, but the invisible labor has stopped. And because no one ever named that labor, its absence feels like failure, even though you never agreed to perform it in the first place. This is where the quiet becomes heavy, not because something is wrong, but because something expected is missing. You can feel the moment when someone waits for you to soften the atmosphere, and you don't, not because you refuse, but because the internal mechanism that used to activate that response doesn't engage anymore. That's when it becomes clear. This isn't about withdrawing from people. It's about a function that collapsed under constant demand. And once that function disappears, the entire relational structure shifts. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in ways that make returning to the old role impossible, even if part of you still feels responsible for it. This is usually the moment when people around you start noticing a change, even if they can't explain it. They say you seem different, more distant, harder to read. But what they are really responding to is the absence of a role you used to perform automatically. For a long time, you were the emotional translator, the one who sensed shifts before words were spoken, the one who adjusted first, softened first, understood first. You absorbed tension so others didn't have to hold it. And now, that role doesn't activate. You're still kind, still attentive, but you're no longer compensating. In conversations, you no longer lean in emotionally before the other person finishes speaking. You wait. In conflict, you no longer rush to repair the atmosphere. You pause, and that pause changes the entire dynamic. Because many relationships were built around your responsiveness, not consciously, but functionally. When that function disappears, the structure wobbles. People feel less held, less mirrored, less regulated, and some of them react not with curiosity, but with pressure. They ask what's wrong with you. They tell you you've changed. They hint that you're becoming cold. But what they are actually responding to is the collapse of a system they relied on, a system you didn't even realize you were maintaining. This is where the quiet becomes costly, because you can no longer return to the version of yourself that filled emotional gaps on demand. Not because you refuse to, but because the internal mechanism that made it possible isn't responding anymore. Something stopped working. And without that function, you're forced to stand in a different position, one where you feel less useful, less needed, and strangely, more alone. This is often when guilt appears. Not sharp guilt, background guilt. The feeling that you're failing at something you were never formally assigned, but always expected to perform. And yet, no matter how much you try to step back into that role, the response doesn't come back online. Because this isn't burnout. It's not exhaustion. It's a deeper withdrawal, one that happens when a system has been overused for too long without recognition. And once it shuts down, you can't revive it through effort. You can only notice that it's gone. After the role collapses, a strange reorganization begins. Not consciously, not neatly. It starts in silence. You find yourself listening more than responding, observing instead of absorbing. You notice emotional patterns in others without entering them. Someone grows upset, and instead of feeling pulled inside their experience, You see the shape of it from a distance. This is unsettling at first, because distance used to mean danger. It used to mean disconnection. It used to mean loss of love. But now, distance arrives without fear. And that's when you realize the quiet isn't empty. It's occupied by something unfamiliar, a different orientation. Instead of moving toward emotion automatically, your system begins to register boundaries, not as rules, not as defenses, but as edges. You start noticing where you end and where others begin, not intellectually, but physically. Your body no longer tenses in anticipation of other people's needs. Your chest doesn't tighten at every emotional shift in the room. And for the first time, you experience a neutral space between stimulus and response. This is often misinterpreted as emotional coldness. But it isn't. It's the absence of compulsion. At first, this absence feels empty. You wait for something to rush in and fill the space, a feeling, a reflex, a familiar emotional signal. Nothing arrives, and without realizing it, you begin to notice how much of your previous inner movement was automatic. Your body used to respond before you had time to decide. Your chest tightened, your breathing adjusted, your attention locked onto the emotional temperature of the room. Now, those signals don't activate. You can sit in the same environment, the same conversation, the same tension, and your body stays neutral. This neutrality feels strange, almost wrong, because for a long time, being affected was how you knew you were present. But slowly, something else becomes noticeable. The space that opened up isn't chaotic. It's structured. You start sensing where your internal reactions used to live, and how much energy they consumed. Not dramatically, quietly. You realize how often your attention used to abandon your own inner state in order to track someone else's. Now, that tracking function no longer runs in the background. Your attention stays closer to you, not in a self-absorbed way, in a grounded way. You notice physical details you didn't register before. The weight of your body on a chair, the rhythm of your breath, the silence between words. None of this feels enlightening. It feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity can be mistaken for loss. But what's actually happening is a reorganization. Your inner system is no longer structured around constant external input. It's recalibrating around something slower and more selective. This is where many people become uneasy. Because without the familiar emotional pull, there's no immediate feedback telling you how to move, how to respond, how to belong. You're not reacting your way into connection anymore. You're waiting. And waiting feels risky when your identity was built around responsiveness. In this space, you begin to realize that empathy hasn't disappeared. What disappeared was the urgency, the compulsion to enter every emotional field, the need to relate what doesn't belong to you. That realization doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as stillness. And stillness, when you're not used to it, can feel like something is missing, even when nothing is wrong. This is the moment when the old map stops working, and the new one hasn't revealed itself yet. And that absence can feel terrifying if your identity was built around responsiveness. Because now, without that constant emotional feedback loop, you're left with a question you never had to face before. If I'm not reacting, who am I? This is where many people try to force warmth back into themselves. They overcorrect. They perform empathy. But performance doesn't restore function. It only creates friction. Because what's reorganizing inside you isn't emotion, it's agency. For the first time, your inner system is not organized around external signals. It's recalibrating internally. And that process is quiet by nature. No fireworks. No insight speeches. Just a slow shift in where your attention lives. And once attention moves, identity follows. Even if you're not ready to admit it yet. At some point, you test it. You step back into an old dynamic. Not fully, just enough to see if the old response still lives there. You listen. You empathize. You open the door slightly. And you notice something unsettling. The old intensity doesn't return. Not because you're resisting, but because the emotional charge no longer hooks into you. It's like touching a switch that once activated a system, only to find it disconnected. That's when you understand this quiet isn't temporary. It's not a phase that passes on its own. It's a structural change. At first, you resist calling it permanent. Not out of denial, but out of habit. You tell yourself that everything cycles, that states pass, that you've been tired before and eventually return to yourself. So you test it, not consciously, not dramatically. You step back into an old interaction, one that used to activate you instantly. You listen carefully. You open space. You allow yourself to feel. And you wait for the familiar internal shift, for the emotional gravity to pull you in. It doesn't happen. What arrives instead is observation. You notice the pattern. You recognize the tone. You see where the other person is emotionally, clearly, accurately. But the hook doesn't catch. There is no internal escalation, no tightening, no urgency to respond in a particular way. That's when something subtle but final occurs. You stop waiting for the reaction to return, not with disappointment, with recognition, because this isn't resistance, and it isn't suppression. The internal pathway that once carried you into other people's emotional worlds no longer opens. And once you see that clearly, effort becomes irrelevant. You realize you could mimic the old response, say the right words, adopt the right tone, but the internal alignment wouldn't be there. It would be performance, and something in you refuses that now. This is where the quiet hardens into certainty. You understand that even if you wanted to go back, you couldn't do it honestly. The version of you that dissolved into others is no longer accessible, not because it was destroyed, but because it no longer fits the internal structure that's forming. This realization doesn't arrive with relief. It arrives with gravity, because you know what it costs. Some relationships will never feel the same. Some expectations will never be met again. Some versions of you are now permanently unavailable. And there is no dramatic announcement to mark that shift. Just a calm, unmistakable knowing. You crossed a threshold without noticing the exact moment it happened. And now, standing on this side of it, you can't return to the way you were, even if you still remember how. The moment you realize this, something inside you settles, not comfortably, but definitively. You stop waiting for yourself to go back. And that's the real point of no return. Because the empathic function you lost wasn't taken from you. It was outgrown. Not in a triumphant way. In a costly one. And while others may still expect the old version of you to respond, you can no longer comply without betraying this new internal configuration. This is where isolation becomes conscious. Not loneliness, but separateness. You feel less fused with the emotional field around you. And while that can feel like loss, it also carries an unfamiliar sense of solidity. You're no longer floating inside other people's inner worlds. You're standing somewhere of your own. That place is quiet, not peaceful, not joyful, but real. Over time, you stop trying to explain this quiet to others. Not because you can't, but because language fails here. There's no dramatic story to tell. No trauma narrative that fits neatly. Just the recognition that a function disappeared because it was no longer sustainable. And with that recognition comes a subtle shift in how you move through life. You choose less, but more deliberately. You speak less, but with more weight. You stop filling silence. And people respond to that silence differently. Some feel threatened. Some feel exposed. Some feel calmer. But none of that is your responsibility anymore. Because the system that once automatically adjusted for everyone else has stepped aside. What remains is quieter, but more aligned. And alignment, when it arrives after years of emotional overextension, doesn't feel euphoric. It feels sparse, like a room with fewer objects, where every sound carries. This is not the end of empathy. It's the end of unconscious empathy. You begin to notice the difference in subtle ways. You don't rush to respond anymore, not because you're withholding, but because nothing is pulling you forward. Silence no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like a neutral space you're allowed to stand in. You might still care deeply, but care no longer translates automatically into action. Someone shares something heavy, and you feel concern, but not obligation. You can acknowledge what they're going through without stepping inside it. This is unfamiliar territory, because for a long time, empathy meant participation. It meant entering, holding, absorbing. Now, empathy looks more like recognition from a distance. You see clearly. You understand accurately. But you remain where you are. That shift can feel lonely at first. Not because you've lost connection, but because connection no longer requires self-erasure. You may notice fewer emotional entanglements. Fewer late-night conversations that leave you drained. Fewer situations where you walk away carrying something that was never yours. And with that reduction comes a quieter life. Not empty, not detached, just less crowded. You start choosing where to invest your presence instead of dispersing it everywhere. And while that selectivity may look like withdrawal from the outside, internally it feels more like conservation. Energy stops leaking. Attention stops scattering. What remains is not warmth in the way you once knew it, but clarity. And clarity, when it replaces constant emotional engagement, can feel stark. But it's also the ground on which something more honest can eventually stand. And once that shift happens, you don't return to the previous configuration. You move forward differently, even if you don't yet know where that forward leads. So if you've noticed this quiet in yourself, this absence of reaction, this delay, this emotional stillness, don't rush to label it as damage. But don't romanticize it either. This is not peace. It's not healing. It's not detachment as a virtue. It's the aftermath of a system that carried too much for too long. A function collapsed. And what's emerging in its place is not louder. It's narrower, more selective, and less available. That can feel isolating, because you're no longer living inside other people's emotional rhythms. You're standing slightly apart from them. But that distance isn't a mistake. It's information. It tells you that the part of you that used to disappear into others has withdrawn. Not in anger, not in fear, but in self-preservation. And once that happens, you don't return to the old version of yourself. You integrate the quiet, or you fight it. After that point, life doesn't become dramatic. It becomes quieter in a different way. You still attend the same gatherings. You still have the same conversations. You still move through familiar spaces. But something in you is no longer synchronized with the emotional rhythm around you. You notice it in pauses that feel longer than they used to. In moments where you don't rush to soften the atmosphere. In silences you no longer feel responsible for breaking. This can feel isolating, not because you're cut off, but because you're no longer merged. You stand slightly apart from the emotional flow, aware of it, but not inside it. And that position comes with a strange clarity. You begin to sense which connections were sustained by your responsiveness alone, which dynamics depended on you absorbing more than your share, which versions of closeness required you to disappear in small, constant ways. That realization doesn't arrive as accusation. It arrives as distance. A clean, quiet distance that doesn't ask to be crossed. From here, you don't rebuild yourself around being needed. You don't organize your identity around emotional availability. You move forward without a script, not withdrawn, not armored, just unavailable to the patterns that once defined you. This is not growth that feels good. It's growth that feels narrow. And narrow paths don't invite applause. They invite precision. And if this feels familiar, then you're not losing empathy. You're learning where it ends. And that knowledge, once it settles, doesn't make you louder. It makes you still.